So this past Friday, I had a very unique privilege of participating in the Shabbat service with our sisters and brothers at JCOGS, the Jewish community of Greater Stowe here in town. And I was invited to deliver the message. So I was able to preach at this amazing, inspiring Shabbat service. And the text that Rabbi David shared with me to preach on, because they too have a lectionary kind of set scriptures that they preach from, it was very timely in that it focused on the final charge of Moses to the Israelites. And we've been looking at the story of Moses over the last 2 Sundays. Like, we're looking at these snapshots of some of these main characters from the Hebrew scriptures. And this text that I preached on, Moses is standing on Mount Nebo, which is in current-day Jordan, and he's looking out from a distance to the Promised Land, the land that the Israelites have been hoping for and waiting to enter in since they escaped Egypt and left bondage and slavery. Now, Moses would end up dying on that mountain. Moses never made it to the Promised Land, but his successor, Joshua, would, in fact, lead the people to take possession of it. And the book of Joshua chronicles the many, many fights and battles and victories that Joshua led the people towards to take possession of this land that God promised was going to be theirs. It took many, many years, but eventually they did settle into this new land, this land flowing with milk and honey, and they were at rest from their enemies. And then before Joshua's death, he gathered all the people together to remind them to observe all that was written in the law of Moses, to not turn away from it to either side. And he says to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. And like Moses before him, Joshua was intentional to leave a legacy of faith as the foundation for their future. And so we pick up now with chapter 24, verse 1. And these are some of the final words of Joshua to the people. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors, Terah and his sons Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in its midst. And afterwards I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your ancestors with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. When they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come up upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did to Egypt. Afterwards, you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I handed them over to you, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then King Balak, son of Zippor of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. He sent and invited Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you, but I would not listen to Balaam. Therefore he blessed you, so I rescued you out of his hand. When you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, the citizens of Jericho fought against you, as well as the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I handed them over to you. I sent swarms of hornets ahead of you that drove out before you 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built, and you lived in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant. Therefore, Revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Gracious God, give us ears to hear, eyes to see, and hearts that are open to receive and respond to your word, your message to us this day. Amen. So when I turned 40, many, many years ago, I decided to do something a little bit different, a little special. I identified 40 individuals who influenced me and helped shape my future. These included childhood friends from kindergarten, immediate and extended family members, close friends from high school and college, coaches, teachers, pastors, youth leaders, and I wrote a letter to each one of them, thanking them for their impact and their influence in my life. And as I was writing these letters, I was instantly brought back to those times and brought back to those places, and I remembered all that I had experienced, all that I had received, and all that I had learned from them. It was meant to be a blessing to them. It ended up being a blessing to me, looking back and realizing how God had placed people in my lives at various times and for various reasons, and every person had an impact that helped form me and shape me. And I took time to remember back. And in my letter, I retold many of those stories. And some of these individuals would call me or wrote back, after they received that, and some of them said, I forgot about that story. I'm so glad you reminded me of that story. I'm so glad that we did that together. I'm so glad we had that shared experience together. It was really a wonderful practice. Now, some of those stories we probably shouldn't really remember or shouldn't tell to other people, like my children, not yet. But they were great, great stories. Thinking about the past helped me and does help me move ahead with courage and faith to step into God's future for me. See, stories, especially those of family history and family origin, they help shape us. These stories remind us of who we are, where we have come from, and that is essential to know where we are going. It's really hard to know where we're going if we don't know where we have come from. So let me ask, just for reflection, have you had the opportunity to ask a family member about your family story? What is your family story? Have you had a chance to go over those pictures, maybe those big binders, It takes like two arms to lift up, and to see photos of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, to learn about where you came from. Or if you are a grandparent or a great-grandparent, have you taken the time to sit down, make a point to sit down and share the stories with your family? We always think we'll have an opportunity to do so, and hopefully that will happen. But very often the stories come out during memorial services. That's what we see. And then the stories are shared. How amazing would it be to not wait until that time to be able to sit down with family and to share the stories that have formed you and have shaped you, that have made you who you are, and have given an identity to your family. When we take time to share and tell our story, you see, we do more than just relay information and history. That's part of it, and that's interesting. But we speak life and we speak legacy into the next generation. And that's one of the things that we do as a church, is we tell the stories of our tradition every time we gather. Sometimes it's done through religious education and instruction. With our children, that's what they're doing downstairs right now. They're learning the story of Jacob and Esau. Sometimes through confirmation, sometimes through adult Bible studies. We have creeds and catechisms that have been passed down through generations. But as we share those, we're sharing much more than just facts or information. One of the things I love about the United Church of Christ is one of their core values is this: our faith is 2,000 years old, but our thinking is not. And I like to actually think that our shared faith goes back a lot longer than 2,000 years, as we, as Christians, claim the faith of Abraham and Isaac and Moses and Joshua as our spiritual ancestors. In the United Church of Christ, in the preamble to the Constitution, says these words: it claims as its own the faith of the historic church, expressed in ancient creeds and reclaimed in the basic insights of the Protestant reformers, but it affirms the responsibility of the church in each generation to make this faith its own, in reality of worship, in honesty of thought and expression, and in purity of heart before God. To know the stories of the past is important, but to make the faith its own in each generation is essential. And that's why we gather to tell stories. We are so thrilled to be able to hire Whitney and Chris Vigneault, to be able to have now faith formation with our middle school and high schoolers. It's such a crucial time in their lives. Parents, you know what I'm talking about. For them to have a community, a safe place of belonging, no matter who they are in life's journey, that they are welcomed here, and that they're going to hear the stories that will connect them to a much bigger family, to a much bigger story. And that's a really important thing for teenagers who are trying to figure out who they are. But it's also really important for all of us, because we're always trying to figure out who we are and our identity. We need to continue to tell the stories. And what's valued in our church are testimonies of faith rather than tests of faith. We don't like tests. We don't have tests of faith, but we like to hear testimonies of faith. What God has done in and through you, which is unique to your story. And so Joshua, that's what Joshua was doing. He shared once again the story, the collective memories and events of his people, a testimony of faith. It was sort of a summary, a recap of what we had been looking at over the last few weeks. And Joshua thought it was very important to retell that story, to remind the people of who they are, to inspire this tribe to then renew this covenant. Once again, as Moses had done, now this was a new generation. It was time for them to say, well, are we in or are we out? And if we're in, we're going to be in, and it's going to be something for us, for this new generation. We are the ones who are going to step into the new promises. And that's one of the things that we do with covenants. And the covenants, we talked about marriage in the ceremonies last week. Baptisms are a wonderful way that we tell the story and renew covenants. Over the past just few months, we've been blessed to have so many baptisms here as part of Stowe Community Church. Paul and Juana Louvier, Kerry and Andrew Pierce, Casey and Nick D'Alberto, Liz and Seth Quoto, among many other parents, have stood here in the gathered assembly of family and friends and our congregation to reaffirm their commitment to faith and to establish a new covenant of grace for their children and for the next generation. People always ask, do you have hope for the church? And I say, absolutely I do. I absolutely have hope. And I believe that the world needs the church more than it maybe ever has. And when I see those families standing here, recommitting their faith and establishing a new covenant of faith with their children, with all of us, it brings me great joy and so much hope. One of the questions we ask parents when they're standing up here is, will you strive as best as you are able, to teach your children the truths and the opportunities of the Christian way, and to live before them and all people in a kindly and Christian way. Another way that we could phrase that would be, will you strive to tell the stories? Will you strive to tell your story to your children and keep telling the stories? In baptism, God works in us, renews our spirits, and reminds us of the knowledge and the call to always be God's people. And this is why we make a point to celebrate baptism in the presence of the community as we are gathered together. Because we are stronger together, we realize that we are a big family. We can't do it alone. We were never meant to do it alone. We need each other. These children need their extended family of brothers and sisters, siblings, aunts and uncles, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents in this congregation and throughout the whole world. Through baptism, you are connected to a family for your whole life. Wherever you go, you know that you have been sealed with God's Spirit, as we say, established in this covenant of love and acceptance and grace. That's a beautiful thing that we, I think, need to be reminded of that as well. We are not alone. We are connected to one another and connected to this great cloud of witnesses who have helped pass on the faith, who have helped reform the faith, and who have helped reshape the faith for us today. When Loretta and I had our boys baptized at the American Church in Paris, we committed them to God. We made a promise to God and to Jack and Blake to do our best to teach them the truths and the opportunities of the Christian way, and to model for them a life of faith as a follower of Christ. And part of that promise was to introduce them to their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents in the faith. And we've been so blessed that wherever God has called us to serve, we've been part of a family. But I want all of you to know that this is a family. Whoever you are, wherever you are in life's journey, you're welcome here. You are connected. You are not alone. And part of this passing on of the faith is telling stories and sharing testimonies. So think about, just for a moment, in your life, flash back to some special moments, some important places, events that were formative in your life, that maybe shaped your faith. Maybe there was a person who introduced you to the faith at one point, or was a Sunday school teacher, or someone brought you to church one time, or somebody said something or did something that changed your perspective about God, that gave you hope. Maybe even special holiday traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation as part of your identity, part of you telling the story. Our Jewish friends do a great job of that. Every time they gather for Shabbat, and when they gather for Passover, they tell the story. And the children are actually prompted to say, why do we do this? Why do we eat this? And they tell the story. You know, we live in a very complex time. I don't have to tell you that. With many competing activities and allegiances, it's increasingly difficult to prioritize faith formation in a culture that seems to not be very sensitive when it comes to scheduling. I mean, my own boys are in flag football on Sunday mornings, right? Times have changed. I'm so grateful any Sunday that you are able to watch or be here, because I know you have choices to make, and sometimes they're really hard choices to make. And so whenever you are able to be here, whenever that is, your presence is a real gift. But even when you can't make it on a Sunday, we can still tell the stories. Still take time around the dinner table or the breakfast table, or as you are walking to school or driving to lacrosse or soccer, or trying to, do the 45-minute commute through the village. You have plenty of time. We understand the challenges, and we're committed to being as creative and flexible as we can to help families to be able to prioritize faith formation. But ultimately, for us all, it does come down to a decision that's often made first at baptism, when your children were really, really young. But at times it needs to be reaffirmed, recommitted, as seasons of life and seasons of our calendar change. As Joshua said, choose today, but for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. We live in a time when our world is in need, and I believe our world is dying for the church to rise up and to tell our story, because we have a great story to tell. We sung about that in one of the hymns. Tell the story of Jesus and his love. It's pretty simple. Jesus and his love for all people, and God's desire to have all made one. We need, even though society sometimes, wants to have little to do with church or religion or faith formation, here's the reality. In society, in our world, we need more love. We need more compassion. We need more truth-telling. We need more forgiveness. We need more reconciliation. I don't think anyone would disagree about that. And where do we find those? It's our faith. Those are the hallmarks of our faith, going all the way back from our ancestors. We need more faith and more hope and more love. We need to tell the story. And when we do, it can bring change and transformation, even if it's just one person, one family, one community at a time. As American cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So I don't know about you, but I want to change the world. And I want to see my children change the world and be agents of change. And we can make it happen as we tell our stories. So, what's your story? What's your story, and who are you going to tell? Amen.